Welcome to our opening panel. I'm really excited to be having a discussion today with a bunch of public and affordable housing experts on what housing is going to look like after this pandemic and how we can ensure that people have access to affordable housing. And so let's do a round of introductions. Richard, would you like to start?
Sure. My name is Richard Gerwitz. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending where you are. Citi Community, I had a group, or co-head a group called Citi Community Capital. We do all the Community Reinvestment Act, community lending and investment for Citibank. That includes market tax credit lending and investing, historic tax credit lending to community development financial institutions, and a variety of other rather unique CRA-focused structured products. But the largest part of our business is lending as a construction lender and a permanent lender, and investing in low-income housing tax credits for affordable housing projects. We're the largest lender in this area, and the only large financial institution, I believe, with a significant balance sheet permanent lender and lender to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, to whom we were also a mortgage banker.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. And let's go to Jacqueline Wagner.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure, maybe good evening in some places. Thank you for inviting me to share today. My name is Jacqueline Wagner. I'm with Enterprise Community Partners. We are a nationwide nonprofit that invests in affordable housing, advances policy related to affordable housing, and provides capacity building for nonprofit partners and public agencies. We've been around for over 35 years and invested north of $53 billion and over 500,000 units and counting. I wanted to share that I would say that we're kind of a one-of-a-kind intermediary, because we not only invest in affordable housing, we actually house 20,000 people. We own 13,000 units. We also do a lot of policy work at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as the TA. And we're strong advocates for people to have housing that they can afford and to do things to eradicate homelessness. I'm responsible for Southern California.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And let's go to Eugene Jones.
Hello, my name is Eugene Jones. I'm the president and CEO of Atlanta Housing. I've been here for about 9 months. Before that, I was in Chicago doing wonderful things. We provide housing to between 50 and 60,000 residents here in the city of Atlanta. We provide public housing and also housing choice voucher or Section 8 housing throughout this city. We have a good team here doing a lot of great things, as my colleagues have done across this country. And so we want to ensure that our residents are being safe under this pandemic and so forth, and also talk about the pandemic before the pandemic. But I'm glad to be here, and thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you all. So quick outline for the panel today. We're going to try and get through 3 questions, specifically addressing homelessness and housing supply are going to be 2 of the topics we'll focus on. And then we're going to try and leave 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So there should be a box in the bottom right hand of your screen. You can enter Q&A questions there, and hopefully we'll get to them. So to start, the first thing I'd love to hear y'all address is what a day in the life looks like right now. How has your work already been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also mounting calls for racial justice in cities across our country?
Well, since this just came about so quickly, we had to make decisions as a housing authority about how we're going to service our clientele, because everything was shut down here in Atlanta and all the other cities across this country. And so we had to make a quick decision about teleworking to get everyone out of this headquarters buildings and all of our other buildings to have a safe environment so they can continue doing operations. We cannot stop. We have to still converse with our tenant population and so forth. And so it's stressful. You know, if you've never been home 8 hours a day with toddlers, it's stressful. If you're seeing your significant other for over 8 hours, it's stressful. And so trying to minimize that stress and so forth, and trying to get out and trying to be safe has been a daunting task. But it's changed. It's going to change for forever.
For us, because we work with so many affordable housing partners across the country, I think it was an awakening when the pandemic came about because they housed thousands of people, and they themselves were at risk of keeping their organization stable and strong. And so the first thing that we did is we run cohorts with a number of nonprofit partners, and we assess what their immediate needs were. And often people don't look at housing providers as frontline people, but these people were responsible for getting people PPE, feeding seniors food. They had their own staff that were vulnerable to COVID or were exposed to COVID. And so we worked tirelessly to hear what they had to do, what they needed, braided all of those things together, and then developed a program where we could roll out resources to them immediately so that they can do what they need to do to keep their operations afloat, as well as provide services for their residents. And I think it has been some of the most meaningful work that we've done here at Enterprise in terms of that immediate response.
So, Sasha, if I could frame this a little bit, as I said, most of the work we do is in affordable housing, and we service, that means we either have it on our balance sheet or with a mortgage servicer for Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, about 1,800, just under 1,800 discrete affordable multifamily projects all around the country. Right now, we have over 350 projects that are actually under construction or being rehabilitated or in lease-up. So the total of those two units provides somewhere around 350,000 all around the country. So the way I see it, there are basically three areas that we've all been affected and that we're spending most of our time in today. And that is focusing on the ability of the tenants in those units to pay. And obviously, as a financial institution who's making mortgage loans, the ability of those owner developers to be able to make their mortgage payments to us on a monthly basis. The second part is the impact that the COVID crisis has had on both new construction and the renovation units. And the third is the market's ability to absorb new project financings for us to continue with the work that we all do to try to put new units on the board. There's obviously a housing crisis that we'll talk about later. In terms of the first part, the renters' ability to pay rent and owners' ability to pay mortgages, the crisis is disproportionately, I think we all know that the crisis has disproportionately affected people with low income, both in terms of loss of jobs and the fact that they really don't have any savings. And so our immediate concern was the ability of those tenants to pay their monthly rent payment and the ability of our owner developers to pay their mortgage payments, particularly in non-Section 8 projects. Section 8 projects, the majority of rent is coming in from HUD, and about 30% of our entire portfolio has a Section 8 contract on it. So what we did is we quickly put together a forbearance program, a program that allowed our owners to skip monthly payments and allow them the time necessary to work with their tenants to work out payment plans or otherwise forgiveness in terms of their monthly rent. And we trained an awful lot of our staff. We have about 200 people all around the country. We trained a lot of our staff to be able to handle what we expected to be a significant number of forbearance requests coming in from those 1,800 loans. But the most interesting thing that I think we have found during this time, and we work with both nonprofit developers and for-profit developers and housing authorities, and I think no matter what, even if you're a for-profit developer, you're mission-driven in this particular niche business. The actual number of forbearance requests that have come in has been far less than we expected. And interestingly enough, when you take a look at the statistics and the information we have coming in from our developers, the payments coming in from tenants has actually been about the same as it was last year. Obviously, this is not the case throughout the entire portfolio in every project, but what's been surprising is the ability or the willingness of people to continue to pay their monthly rent. There really hasn't been the type of drop in collections that we expected, and developers also have certain reserves or cash on hand that they've been willing to make their monthly mortgage payments. So that's actually been relatively surprising. And we all I think that one of the reasons that renters have been able to make those payments is because of the enhanced unemployment insurance that's been provided by the federal government. And our big concern right now is the ending of that unemployment insurance enhancement. And obviously there's been some discussion over the last few days of perhaps continuing it, but we think that's going to be incredibly important. The second issue is the impact on new construction and rehabilitation. And for the most part, construction specifically of affordable housing has been considered critical infrastructure in most areas of the country. So except for situations where we have a worker on site who's been diagnosed with the virus itself and we've had to stop work, the work has generally continued on the projects that we have under construction. They're delayed, and we're suggesting that there's probably going to be delays in bringing those projects online, and that has implications for all of us. But it is, in fact, getting done. The second part of the preservation part of what we do, however, renovation and preservation, has been far more difficult. Because in those cases, we need to get workers into people's units. We need to get people out of those units in order to renovate their apartments. And that has slowed considerably. So we've all taken a very cautious approach, both from a financial institution side and investor side, and developers in terms of that. And it's slowed the renovation considerably. And then finally, in terms of new projects coming online, we have found that in some cases, with shelter-in-places, municipal offices aren't open, recording offices aren't open, and we haven't been able to record documents to actually close new transactions, new project financings, and get those projects online. One of the things actually that's been kind of interesting, the crisis has obviously accelerated this type of digital activity that we're all participating in right now. But we're now starting to see a lot more acceptance of digital signatures, for example, and digital notaries. And so we're able to use techniques that we haven't used, or that probably would have taken years to put in place, and we're starting to do that. And finally, in terms of the three areas that we've been most impacted, there has been increasing difficulty, and certainly in some geographic areas, in terms of being able to assemble the capital necessary to build new projects or to renovate new projects. There's an unease about the economy. There's an uncertainty in terms of the investors in this product, in terms of low-income housing tax credits. And so people what we've seen is either an unwillingness to invest in tax credits in certain part of the country, or a significant drop in the pricing of tax credits that's made it a lot more difficult to get the capital, the sources and uses to match up on a project. The same pressures have impacted the lending market as they have the equity market, but not quite to the same extent. And then finally, the crisis has obviously affected tax collections. And it's also increased the cost. There are new costs that cities, counties, state governments are having to bear in terms of the health crisis as a result of COVID. And so there are huge budget gaps and shortfalls throughout the country. So this type of housing requires subsidy. And we've seen subsidy levels drop significantly in places like New York City. We're concerned about it here in California, but that's all around the country. And we need that subsidy in order to make these transactions work. So that's been a real concern and a continuing concern for our businesses.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's all some interesting. It sounds like there's a lot of concerns that we would have anticipated, but also some issues in there.
I think you're way off base, though. I think you're dreaming about the situation. You're looking at it on a different level, and I'm looking at it at a human level about people who live in our public housing and assisted housing units, and they're stressed out about paying their rent and not having a job and so forth. You're saying developers always have some type of residual rainy day fund or something like that. That's not the case. I'm not sure where you're thinking of that, but that's not the case. Maybe in your business, but not in our business. Developers are screaming. We have investors who are screaming. They got to pay the mortgage and so forth. September and October, that's when we're going to find out the true effect of what this pandemic is going to have. And then if Congress doesn't act and do something differently, then we're all going to be doing this. If I'm looking at 28 million people are potentially going to be homeless, well, how many of that were before the 28 million? Is that new, or is that in addition to the pandemic, before the pandemic? Because we were in problems before this ever happened. Homelessness, not enough affordable housing. We have affordable housing. We really don't quite understand what affordable housing really means to everyone. If I'm working at McDonald's, affordable housing means something different to me. If I'm working at a transportation company, affordable housing means different to me. I'm worried about paying my rent and having a job. And the longer that the wait, the worse it's going to get. And developers, investors, they want to get paid. They want to get paid on time. And if it's not, they're going to foreclose and so forth and so forth. So just wait and see what happens.
I'm going to cut in. Sorry, Jacqueline, did you have something brief to say?
I just wanted to say that to Richard's point, it's been some of our observations that people are still paying, but our partners are starting to slowly scream about what they anticipate coming forward. The amount seems small now, but we are all on the cliff edge of everybody. The moratoriums being lifted across the country, which means people won't be able to pay their mortgages and people won't be able to stay in their homes because most people do not live in low-income housing tax credit housing. They live in small multifamily, which are owned by mom and pop owners who have other financial obligations. So it's really important that we have policies and resources to help settle everyone's debts so that we don't have this huge growth of homelessness, not only here in the U.S., but across the country. This is a huge issue that is just on the cliff. And to Eugene's point, it's just around the corner, and we need to really work at every level of government to seek out resolutions and have some foresight.
And just one other point.
I think, I'm going to cut in just because I think this relates to our next question. And I want to make sure we're moving on so we get to Q&A. But you can start on the next question. Also, quick procedural thing. We're getting some comments in the chat that there's some feedback. So just if we can remember to when you're not talking, that'd be great. But it sounds better than it did a few minutes ago from my end. So I wanted to actually get to a point that Eugene mentioned. So a lot of us have seen that CNBC reported this week that as many as 28 million Americans could be at risk of homelessness as a result of the looming eviction crisis, and also what Richard mentioned, that unemployment benefits are set to expire at the end of July. And so I want to hear more about what you've already been talking about what can be done in order to prevent this, and also what services we need to be providing on the ground to people who are experiencing homelessness right now or might be shortly.
One of the things that we lack in this country is having a national housing policy that everyone agrees to. If you look at all the politicians, congressional and so forth, the last thing on their agenda, the top 20, housing is at 19 or 20. Transportation, healthcare, and education is always on the top, but never is housing. Nowhere in this country where we find there's a national housing policy. Yes, the homeless population is going to get worse unless they do something in Congress to keep going the unemployment benefits and so forth. And how do you get to these agencies, not just housing authorities, but these other multifamily units and so forth? How do you forgive that rent for a time being until we come to some normalcy, whenever that might be? I think it puts a burden on the cities. Now you can't collect taxes. You're not getting there's no businesses being done. How do you redo that and redo we need to redo 2020, really, what it comes down to. But homeless population is gonna be very bad for specific cities like LA, Chicago, all these big cities and so forth, New York City and so forth. what I've been taught before is that you got to have a house first, and then you can tackle the homeless issues with supportive services and so forth. They go hand in hand. You just can't have housing and put them in a house and eradicate homelessness. It doesn't work that way. You have to have the services, the wraparound services, and those come with public-private partnerships. And that's what we need to start putting in place right now, putting a map in place on how we're going to get to the end of this year and how can we save jobs in this economy that we're in.
No, I mean, the biggest challenge is definitely the expiration of the unemployment insurance, as well as the other thing that's critical right now is the expiration of a lot of eviction moratoriums that have been put in place. So they're starting to end around the country, and in those, clearly very concerned about those cities and the fact that and those areas, we would expect that homelessness is going to increase dramatically. There was a recent study that the National Housing National Housing Conference put out, that Lending Tree done, that something like 30 million of the 100 million households that rent around the country are concerned about their ability to make the next month's payment. So that's a real concern, I think, for all of us. So the most immediate thing that can be done is the extension of unemployment insurance at the federal level, plus the inclusion of some sort of rent relief for renters in the next action that Congress takes. The work I do, financing new construction and rehabilitation, really isn't very well suited to meet the immediate need created by a crisis like this. What we do is really measured in years, not months. But I've been very impressed with some of the actions taken by local government and state governments here in California, in New York, and other places. There's obviously been a devastating impact on certain industries around the country, including the hotel industry. And a lot of those hotels are having to go out of business and sell their properties. And state governments, local governments are stepping in, taking a look where they may be able to buy units quickly and house people more immediately. So I know, Jacqueline, that you have been following that quite closely, and I think that's one of the most immediate things we can do to try to help alleviate the immediate need right now.
Well, I have a lot to say about this subject. So first of all, I don't think that when we started experiencing the consequences of COVID-19 that we realized that we would be dealing with a pandemic and then awakening the endemic of racism across the globe. And if you look at who's on the brink of homelessness, who's experiencing homelessness, Black and brown folks are disproportionately impacted in COVID. And the uprising is doubling down on what's been going on for hundreds of years. And it's time for us to eradicate this long history of not doing right by those who are marginalized, that are on the front lines, who make sure we eat, can get clothing, provide all kinds of services. And so for people across the globe, California is the beacon of hope. Here, I think our governor, Gavin Newsom, is doing a great job, and our leaders here regionally have been trying to take extreme measures to eradicate homelessness and address those disparities that we see in these numbers. We have done a lot. We've done something called Project Roomkey. In addition to being an enterprise vice president, I'm also a commissioner of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is the continuum of care here in the region. And they launched a program called Project Roomkey with Governor Gavin Newsom to house people immediately that are over the age of 65 to get them into immediate housing, those that don't have shelter. And through that program, we've housed about 4,000 people. The North Star was 15,000. We haven't achieved that, but they have drafted a plan that has a huge number to try to bring people indoors. Because one thing that we've learned about COVID is you can't quarantine, you can't be at home if you don't have a roof over your head. And the only way that people can get better or do anything for themselves is if they have housing. Everyone needs housing. And it affects all of us when other people don't have housing because of the spread of the disease and other things. So if now more than ever, we really need our public agency partners to bring that full push and pull of all the things that we need, the policies and the resources. I will say California has stepped up and doubled down on that, and it's been complemented by our city and county, as well as resources coming from the federal level. But to Eugene's point, we need so much more. We know that, there's millions of households that are homeless. Well, 500,000 households are homeless here in the U.S., and then millions of people on the brink of it. And no one can get better if they're severely rent burdened and stressed out about being able to pay their mortgage, or if they're going to end up on the street tomorrow. So I think it's imperative now that we really have a real conversation about what it looks like of giving people the right fit housing for themselves. And so I'm excited. That's the silver lining of COVID-19, has been able to daylight some really critical challenges in the housing sector. And I think that we'll learn is if we do better for others, we'll all be better together. And I think that COVID-19 is daylighting the importance of that, and as also the cultural shift we're addressing in racism. So I see the future as that, as it relates to health and housing. Enterprises work with Kaiser Healthcare. We've worked with United Healthcare. And I think that we need to look at health and housing as a close tie. People that are experiencing homelessness almost need a prescription to figure out where they're going next. We don't have that now. We just say, oh, you live in this bridge housing. Oh, you live in the shelter. Or we just leave people to languish on our sidewalks. And I think that if we could really fully assess each person's needs and then get them on a pathway to something permanent, that we can end homelessness. But we actually have to start with that and not just let people float, but figure out what people need, the amount of money it's going to take to do it, which is a huge amount of money. But I would say it's a huge amount of money to do it, but it's costing us even more not to do something about it.
Thank you all so much. As a follow-up to that question, I loved what Jacqueline said. I think it was really insightful about the fact that certain populations are disproportionately affected by homelessness and rent burdens. And I'm curious, given the conversation we're having nationally, if y'all would support reparations for Black and Brown people in housing and what that might look like, specifically addressing the needs of those communities, both for people who are already facing homelessness and people who are on the brink of it.
I don't know if I would sit there and say reparations are going to be the end all. I just think what I have said before, there needs to be a national housing policy. And with that policy, Congress needs to enact the adequate resources. Jacqueline and Richard can't do anything. The states are limited in what their funding can be and so forth. They're doing a great job and so forth. But homelessness is still a problem. It's still been a problem in LA before the pandemic. It still hasn't been eradicated, and it's still going to be the same unless we have adequate federal resources right now to eradicate at least 3/4 of it, because we're not going to eradicate all of it, but 3/4 of it. If Congress just listen to the practitioners, not the individuals at the universities with, they have these glowing assessments and numbers, and if you do this, well, no one's attaching resources to that. If you sit down with the practitioners, they'll tell you exactly what they need and where they need to come from and so forth. You can't have housing without wraparound services if you want to eradicate homelessness. And then homelessness, it's the count. Who's counting? Because a lot of people are living in cars who are homeless who have not been counted. There's a lot of kids going to school who have been homeless that you don't know about or anything like that. A lot of people are doubling up and so forth. So, if it's 28 million, I'll still say if you multiply it by 2, and that might be your real number right now. But again, you have a number. So Congress needs to take this, a politician who is a strong leader can take this, like Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who's working on the bill and so forth. They're all doing it, but it becomes partisan politics. It's the empathy that is lacking in Congress to me.
Um, I think I would say that we should all be clear on one thing. Housing ends homelessness. So we need to build more housing and we need to remove all of the barriers. The government can't do it alone. We do need people like Richard and Citibank to invest. We need public, private sector, everyone on board. We have to dig ourselves out of the hole because what we have done is we, for decades, have failed to build the housing that we really need. And it's going to take the public and private sector and joint partnership to do that. And I would say that you not only need the political will and resources, you also need the willingness for people to site housing in their communities. We need to remove all the red tape. We need to build housing near transit corridors where we can have more healthier living, where maybe people can walk to work, walk to school, walk everywhere they need to go. I think that we need a different strategy and create a stronger housing system where we can use our resources more efficiently and effectively to help people. And if we start there and use the same data that we call out to call out and identify the inequities in the housing system to determine how we spend money, that would put us on the right path to recovery for everyone.
Thank you so much. That's actually a great transition to the next topic that we are going to discuss, which is housing supply. So the National Low-Income Housing Partnership has estimated that the United States has a shortage of over 7 million homes affordable to extremely low-income renters. And that was a statistic from before the onset of the pandemic. And so I'm curious what can be done to close this gap, and whether we anticipate that construction will be affected by the pandemic, especially like financially in the long term. And so maybe we can start with Richard on this question, because it sounds like he has expertise around.
Well, I think we all have some expertise in it, but obviously we've been talking a lot about low income, and that's the most pressing problem I think that we all, that exists right now, particularly in the face of the COVID crisis. But the fact of the matter is we've been underbuilding for years. Pretty much all segments of the population, the working population, have problems finding affordable housing. Police officers, firefighters, teachers, healthcare workers can't find affordable housing anywhere near the places that they work in many parts of the country, particularly in expensive urban areas. And our failures have basically led to increasing commutes, more pollution, and just devastation in all kinds of society. We typically lay it to NIMBYism, and clearly that's an important part of it. But there are also the tools that are used to enforce the types of the lack of housing, like hardened zoning codes that have been in place for years that prevent housing from being built in places that it should be built, in neighborhoods where families can get good education, good health care, and access to services. So the couple of things that I think, these are hard things to change, but a couple of things that we've seen that we're focusing on are states, cities. My own city took an inventory of all the property that is municipally owned, either that's vacant right now, or that's being used for bus depots or storage yards that can be repurposed, and then ranking those from easiest to redevelop to least easiest to redevelop, and leasing that land to affordable housing developers, to workforce housing developers who can build housing. One of the greatest costs of housing is land acquisition, particularly in high cost areas, and that could be a form of subsidy when municipalities and states are hard pressed to find funds that they can put into housing. Another thing that might be done is repurposing commercial areas or industrial zones that are not being used as intensely, or that rationally could also include some sort of multifamily housing to expand the amount of land available for housing development. We've seen some success in changing laws to allow ADUs, accessory dwelling units, So a second unit on a single family property where a renter might be able to live and expand the housing supply. We need to bring down the cost of housing. In certain neighborhoods, it might cost anywhere from $750,000. It may cost $750,000 a unit to build a unit of affordable housing. It's ridiculous. We need to find ways, including manufactured modular housing, to try to bring down those costs and do it in a more efficient way so we could stretch the dollars that we have and stretch the opportunities. And finally, as Jacqueline said as well, we need to somehow speed the entitlement process and get rid of red tape. In many cases, a housing developer, an affordable housing developer, has to put in 2-3 applications and wait years for those applications to be approved. There should be a single place where you can apply for subsidy, apply for bond allocation, apply for tax credits, and make sure and get an efficient response as quickly as possible so that we can also speed up the supply of housing development.
As a follow-up, I'm curious what Eugene's thoughts are on, I've seen some recent initiatives in Congress to repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment. If listeners aren't familiar with that, it's a federal policy that restricts our ability to increase the supply of public housing nationwide without, basically you can't build new public housing without selling some of it off. And you can't increase the supply of public housing nationwide. So I'm curious, Eugene, given your experience with working at the Public Housing Authority, what your thoughts are, if you think that's a good idea.
I do think it's a good idea, but be mindful of what happened to public housing before. If you do not provide adequate capital resources to maintain those public housing units, it's going to go back into the same quadrant that we have. People have to move out, we have to destroy them, demolish them, and so forth. So yes, we do need to build new affordable housing, public housing, but they have the resources every year to maintain the integrity of public housing and bring it back into the forefront.
Great.
Yeah, and you know what? I agree with Eugene about public housing, but I think it's true for all housing, right? All housing, you need to reinvest in it. And the one of the challenges is that people's income wages are not matching the increases in rents, and so it's hard to finance and underwrite preservation. But we're really not going to build our way out of this problem. We have to figure out how we preserve our existing housing stock and invest in it. But the other thing I wanted to say related to construction and building housing is that we need to apply more rigor and discipline and require people to build the housing that has been assessed. There's needs assessments. They're written all the time. They're written everywhere. We know how many units we need, but we never match the policy and the resources to do it. And I think that ultimately, if we want to address the housing issues in any region across the world, you must use the data that should guide how you do the work. I think that we use some of the data or say that, we have 10,000 units and we just want to build 1,000, and that's not working. It's finally caught up to us. And we actually need to get stronger policies and resources in place. And I know I always say the government could really play a strong piece here, but I think the value of private capital from banks and corporations is essential to get us out of this. We need to leverage everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. I want to give a quick reminder to the audience that we're going to move on to Q&A soon. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I want to ask a follow-up specifically around, Richard mentioned this in his opening statement, but what we can expect investment to look like from the private industry following the pandemic. Obviously, we're entering a major recession. Is that going to affect the amount of capital available?
I mean, I can only, from a financial institution point of view, whenever something like this happens, people obviously become, financial institutions become more cautious. We do really have, the way the housing system has been set up in the United States, it is a public-private partnership. Public housing is obviously, new public housing is obviously no longer built. So it really depends on the health of the economy and the institutions around it. There's been a lot of demand for capital from financial institutions, not only in the real estate sector, but in the retail sector and other businesses that are suffering as a result of the pandemic. And so whenever you have those types of demands on large financial institutions or regional financial institutions, they inevitably start to slow their lending to make sure they have enough capital to support the project, the loans, and the activity that's occurring. So I think it's inevitable that if this continues for an extended period of time, we're going to continue to see a softening in the tax credit market, and we're going to continue to see a reluctance to lend, not knowing what the future holds. I think, but we are, on the other hand, we at Citigroup, I know a lot of my colleagues at other financial institutions feel that the most important thing we can do is provide capital to the affordable housing industry. It's one area of real estate at Citibank that's still lending to the extent it was last year. Whereas other areas have slowed, we've actually picked up speed, and our production in terms of the number of projects that we've been able to lend to for the first 6 months of this year has actually exceeded the number that we lent to in 2019, which was a bit of a surprise to me, quite frankly.
Great. All right, let's move on to audience Q&A. So we have several questions from the audience, so let's try and do more rapid fire answers on these so we can try and address everyone possible. So one question I'm seeing in the chat that I'm personally very fascinated by is this person is not, they say they're not a US American, and they're curious what the biggest impediment to a coherent and comprehensive US national housing policy has been, and has any administration ever come close to creating one?
I would say no. That's rapid.
I take a little bit of, I have a little bit of optimism, only in the sense, because the national housing policy has never been really on the table, is that it's finally in in candidates' agendas. People actually talk about housing, which I suppose is a first step. But I agree, we're very far from a national housing policy at this point.
I would just say, yeah, we're really far, but I think the connection to health and housing, the pandemic is going to make this conversation really, hopefully, stronger and robust. I hope in the coming years. So I see that as a silver lining as some of what's happening right now.
Great. Yeah. I would say one of the things that we've noticed in this past election cycle is, I admit my bias, I'm less familiar with the Republican platforms, but almost every Democratic candidate had a housing platform for the first time. And that was found by data from research from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So that's cool. But yeah, we have differing policy than other countries on this. All right, moving on to a different question. So COVID-19 is a pandemic that's probably going to stay around for a longer time. So with this pandemic around the world, how can cities strike a balance between addressing health and home?
I think they're doing it right now by providing housing. I mean, we've had a lot of unsheltered Angelenos or Californians for a really long time, but the pandemic caused us to move to find some more immediate solutions so people could come indoors, those that wanted to. And I think that puts us on the pathway to connecting health and housing as a strategy, more so in the region, because we know that people can't get better. They can't avoid contracting the virus if they are not housed. So I think that we're getting started on that pathway because of the pandemic.
And Sasha, I also think that forward-thinking health departments have recognized that there's a connection between health and housing, that the cost of having people on the street and then using emergency room services and the cost of hospital stays and the other social services that are provided to people who are on the streets is a huge cost to municipalities and to the governments around the country. And so that a number of health services agencies are using a portion of their funds to actually help with housing, either by providing support services directly to permanent and supportive housing projects, or actually even helping to fund flexible rent payment assistance. And I think that's something that will actually reduce the cost to everyone for that in terms of the homeless part of the homeless crisis.
Great. Eugene, do you have anything to add on this, or should we move on to the next question?
Just move on to the next one.
Not to put you on the spot. All right. So this audience member says, I've read that many of the issues related to affordable housing have in some part to do with HUD's failure to hold cities and states accountable to HUD's policies regarding housing. Can anyone talk to that?
I kind of disagree with that. You know, you're dealt with a shorthand, and you got to make amends with what you have. HUD can only do so much of what Congress allocates to them, and then HUD brings that to the agencies that my colleagues across this country. We try to make do with what we have. Hello?
You're back.
It's magical.
I don't know what happened.
Something you said, Eugene.
Someone clicked me off. I just think that we need to look at HUD differently, how HUD delivers the services that they do with not just with housing authorities, but all the public-private entities across this country. I mean, no one's talking about increasing opportunity zones, that there's new and so forth. And we also need to start thinking about density. You know, density works in Canada. How they work it and how they do it, it's interesting. But, you know, you can't build sprawl anymore and get the best bang for your buck. You know, like Richard has said, you know, $770,000 for a unit and so forth, and it's based on where your locality is and so forth. You know, unless we cut costs, construction costs, just like Richard has said and Jacqueline, red tape is a big one. How can we get HUD to back off of some of the red tape? If we got to build it, let's build it. You know, cut the zoning process a bit, so that we can put housing on the ground, provide services and so forth, and move on to the next agenda item.
All right, let's move on because we have lots more questions. We are probably not going to get to all of them, but there's a lot of very interesting ones. All right, this one seems relevant to what we were just talking about. Do you see upzoning as one remedy for housing and inequality? And maybe if someone wants to define what upzoning is for audience members who aren't familiar.
I was waiting for Jacqueline. I thought she was poised to say something there. But, you know, so I mean, upzoning is basically changing zoning designation, right? Either by changing it to allow in terms of allowed uses, or increasing density, as Eugene said. And it is a partial solution to making sure that there's enough land, developable land, to build housing in areas that it might not otherwise be able to be built. So while it's not it would be one arrow in the quiver of trying to make sure that we have enough available property to build additional housing. I mean, the solution to the crisis, at least a partial solution to the crisis, is building more housing, increasing supply versus demand. The number of household formations over the last decade has substantially outpaced the number of new units that are being built and preserved. And so that's a dynamic we definitely have to change, and upzoning can certainly be one of them.
I would have said the same thing, Richard. Thank you. No, but the other thing I would say, we need density, but we actually need to make sure that the housing that gets built through upzoning is affordable. Because a lot of the upzoning happens and people get those benefits from the public, but they don't include enough affordable housing for people that work and have lived in those neighborhoods for a really long time. So that was the only thing I would add to what Richard said, is to make sure it has an allocation of affordable housing.
I agree.
Great. All right, I'm going to try and get to 2 more questions in our last 4 minutes. So one I'm seeing here, are there concerns that the predatory buying up of defaulted mortgages by real estate investment trusts, et cetera, we saw following the 2008 housing crisis might reoccur without proper regulations in place?
I know you know this one, Richard.
Well, I'm not a single family guy. Jacqueline, you probably have done some work on this. I mean, clearly there's a concern whenever we have this type of a problem that people that people are going to default on single family mortgages. And those single family mortgages during the last crisis were certainly were purchased in large number by opportunistic, I would call them, buyers who are renting them. That certainly could be another impact of this COVID crisis. I haven't seen it really on the multifamily side. Jacqueline, you might be seeing it on the smaller units perhaps, but we certainly don't really see it on the units that, the larger projects, 100, 200 units at a clip.
I would say that yes, it's a huge threat, and it rips apart the fabrics of these communities. And it's important that we advance policy to prevent all of these. Really, I am a believer in the free market to an extent. When you begin to rip away people's opportunity to have a home where they can, raise their children, go to work, and other things, that's when I begin to push back. And I think the relics of 2008 could bleed into 2020. And I think it's important that we manage that by putting forth policies to prevent that from happening again, so that people that live in the community can own those. I haven't seen it so much in small multifamily, but there's a lot of cash in the market. There are things that are moving. At Enterprise, we do a lot around small multifamily preservation, and we've been trying to go after these assets, and many of them are not feasible unless you have some subsidy. And so the market that's out there buying them is actually projecting that they would raise the rents and put people out to make the project feasible. So that is my worry. I think the assets need to be in the right hands if we want to stabilize people that need to be helped.
But one of the significant differences I would point out between this crisis and the last crisis, and I'll be really short because I know you want to get to one more question, is that there was a lot of predatory lending right before the last financial crisis that resulted in financial institutions and others creating mortgages that were really inappropriate, and then selling those mortgages. That obviously, hopefully, that was one lesson that was learned during the last crisis, so we don't have the same sort of a cliff that we had last time that we fell
off. Can't hear you.
You take us off mute, Sasha.
All right, now we couldn't hear you.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, ironically, I was saying that please remember to mute your chat when you're not talking. But we're going to attempt one last question in the minute or two that we have left. There's a lot of questions about, I'm hearing today that one of the issues is lack of funding from the federal government for support of rehabilitating public housing and private housing as well, and just support from the government that used to exist 50 years ago. And so there's some questions about where do we see opportunities to reallocate existing funding resources from the government. Someone suggests oil, subsidies for oil. So curious what people think about that.
I don't know about subsidies for oil, but I see that we're one-dimensional when it comes to housing. We should look at funding from HHS. We should look at funding from Department of Transportation. We should look at funding from Veterans Administration and from the Education Department. As Jacqueline and Richard have said, it takes that partnership in order to facilitate a better neighborhood and a better community. If you start putting housing in the mix instead of putting housing on the bottom of the totem pole, then funding can be adequate because we're sharing resources for the common good about building closer transportation lines and so forth, building closer to better schools and so forth, better to be co-located by a major hospital and so forth. So you have synergies that you built in these different communities across this country. So think differently instead of thinking just, a tunnel vision. We've had tunnel vision for a long time.
All right, great. So we should probably wrap up, but thank you all, unless anyone has a quick last comment.
I would just say that people that struggle with housing policy, ask them where they slept last night. None of us can have better health. None of us can get to work. We can't do anything to help ourselves when we don't have a place to sleep. It's imperative that we have a housing platform. Eugene said it earlier. I'm reiterating it. And we need all of us to get out of it. The government, even though we keep saying the government, they're a very important player, but they're not the sole player. We do need Citicorp. We do need other banks. We do need corporations. And we need all of us to give. Us as individuals need to give so that we can house everyone.
Great. Thank you all so much. I found this a super informative discussion, and I hope the audience has as well. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. And so I believe we're probably handing it back to Greg and John.
Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you, Sasha, Eugene, Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much.